Order, members. The next item of business on the order paper is the second stage of the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill. And I call John Blair to move the second stage.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the second stage of the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill be agreed.
The second stage of the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill has been moved. In accordance with the Convention, the Business Committee has agreed that it has not allocated any time limits on the debate overall. However, it has agreed limits on individual contributions. The sponsor of the bill will have 30 minutes to move and a further 15 minutes to wind. The Minister will have up to 20 minutes to contribute, and the Chair of the Committee and all other speakers will have up to 15 minutes. I now call Mr Blair to open the debate on the bill. Mr Blair.
Deputy Speaker, again, I thank you and will proceed to point out that Northern Ireland is the only part of the United Kingdom without a ban on hunting with dogs, despite widespread public support for a ban, and that should include the practice of fox hunting and deer hunting. It is my opinion, and that widely of the public, that hunting with dogs is a cruel and unnecessary sport that causes immeasurable suffering to both the hunted animal and the hunting dogs, which can also see horrific injuries, especially during what is known as terrier work. It is my intention in bringing forward my private member's bill to reform legislation of hunting wild mammals with dogs in Northern Ireland to bring our legislation in line with that in England, Scotland and Wales, where the practice has been illegal for nearly 20 years. Deputy Speaker, a ban on hunting with dogs in Northern Ireland is long overdue. This has been my personal and political stance for many years. It is also the policy position of my party, the Alliance Party. I am firmly of the belief that animals being ripped to shreds by packs of dogs for the purposes of human enjoyment cannot be considered as a sport, and that fox hunting and stag hunting should have no place in a civilised society. Between December 2020 and February 2021, I conducted a consultation exercise over an 8-week period in relation to the private member's bill. There were 18,425 responses to the survey, which is thought to be the largest response ever to a private member's bill in this Assembly, and that shows the strength of feeling on this issue, Deputy Speaker. An overwhelming majority of respondents, 78.16%, agreed with the proposals and said that all hunting, searching, coursing, capturing or killing wild mammals with dogs should be banned in Northern Ireland. An even greater majority, 79.6%, of respondents said that they considered terrier work, that the activity to use dogs to attack or cause the wild mammal to flee its cover, to be unacceptable. Following consultation and deliberation, I considered that creating primary legislation was the best mechanism by which to achieve the policy objectives comprehensively and to introduce appropriate penalties for breaches of the proposed law. The bill will bring, therefore, a consequential amendment to the Welfare of Animals Act Northern Ireland 2011 to ensure a coherent statutory framework is in place. The bill aims to introduce a ban on hunting wild mammals to death with dogs, and without introducing legislation, this practice cannot be banned. I also intend for the legislation to facilitate prosecutions and subsequent penalties to act as a deterrent for future hunting using dogs to kill wild mammals. I am also conscious of loopholes in the legislation in other jurisdictions, such as trail hunting being used as cover for prescribed fox hunting. Accordingly, provision to address this has been included in the bill. The legislation, as proposed, ensures that Northern Ireland leads the way with a full and comprehensive ban on hunting with dogs and does not duplicate the exemptions and loopholes which have allowed animals to continue to be chased and killed in the rest of the UK. There is, Deputy Speaker, a historic opportunity to tackle the scourge of hunting with dogs once and for all in Northern Ireland. We need to end this brutally cruel activity which has no place in a modern-day society. I will now, Deputy Speaker, refer to and seek to outline the various sections of the bill as it has been introduced to this Assembly. In the year 2000, a UK parliamentary inquiry into hunting with dogs, commonly referred to as the Burns Report, established and concluded that animals suffer incredible physiological and psychological stress when chased by a hunt, and this suffering occurs whether or not they are eventually killed. This evidence led to a ban in England and Wales, the Hunting Act 2004. In 2002, the Protection of Wild Mammals Scotland Act 2002, the Scotland Act 2002, protected certain wild mammals from being hunted with dogs and placed restrictions on the practice of hunting wild mammals with dogs. Northern Ireland remains the only jurisdiction within the United Kingdom without a ban on hunting with dogs, which includes fox hunting and deer hunting. The bill aims to introduce a ban on hunting wild mammals to death with dogs, with a definition broad enough to include deers, foxes, rabbits and mink. The bill also, Deputy Speaker, intends to ban trail hunting, defined as any process in which one or more dogs are introduced or permitted to follow the scent of a wild mammal, whether the trail of scent has been led naturally or by human intervention. This activity, it should be noted, was non-existent, not even envisaged when the Hunting Act 2004 was drafted. It is therefore crucial that a hunting with dogs ban in Northern Ireland prevents trail hunting from being used as cover for illegal hunting. I will at this point give way.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Will the member be aware of a recent court case in which it was found that trail hunting is precisely, as the member describes, simply a cover for fox hunting?
I am, Deputy Speaker, aware of that, and I'm about, coincidentally, to refer to it in a line or two later in the speech. Deputy Speaker, loopholes in the legislation in England, Wales and Scotland have been exposed which allowed hunting to continue under guises including trail hunting. Such exemptions are widely abused, making potential prosecution difficult and cannot be justified. It is imperative that Northern Ireland eliminates loopholes which have been highlighted in the recent court case in GB when the Westminster Magistrates Court found a leading huntsman guilty and ordered him to pay £3,500 for giving advice on how to legally carry out hunts. It was described as a landmark case on this issue. The court heard that he told members of the hunting office at 2 webinars in August last year, to use the legal form of trail hunting as a, quote, smokescreen for the criminal activity. Additionally, the bill introduces a ban on terrier work, defined as a process in which dogs are induced to enter a hole in the ground in order to flush out or otherwise force a wild mammal to leave the hole, or in order to make it easier or quicker to dig a wild mammal out of the hole. This is a simple description for the purpose of the speech, Deputy Speaker, but I can assure you the footage I have seen of this activity is harrowing and makes for uncomfortable viewing. A secondary matter with terrier work that I was made aware of during the consultation process is that terriers can often sustain injuries, and it can be the case that professional veterinary care is not sought and dogs are treated elsewhere. I've heard reports of dogs having staples in their jaws and superglue in their mouths as intended fixes. These injuries also suggest that the dogs impacted in such circumstances were used for activities other than simply flushing rabbits and may have been involved, for example, in illegal badger baiting. Such are the extent of their injuries. The bill, Deputy Speaker, allows for exemptions. Hunting is exempt from the prohibition in Clause 1 if it is confined to hunting rats or mice, or if it complies with all of the conditions listed in Clause 4. Hunting that satisfies the conditions listed in the exemptions will not be deemed to be illegal. The exemptions cover protection of livestock, crops, biodiversity and hunting which puts food on the table, as well as established and historic practice and a part of country life. The bill, Deputy Speaker, has introduced permits the hunting of wild mammals for the protection of biodiversity. However, I would like to raise at this point that hunting with dogs is more likely to have an adverse impact on wildlife conservation and the wider environment. One of the most obvious characteristics of hunting with dogs undertaken by organised hunts is the fact that it is based on a large pack of big dogs that would be moving through the land at high speed, followed by many people often on horseback. Where this occurs, it is bound to have an impact on the land, as the hounds would naturally not care about disturbing the natural habitat where they are hunting, including perhaps the ground used by nesting birds, which are already protected by law. These consequences of recreational hunting and biodiversity conservation have been supported by a number of reviews and reports. Members will also note that drag hunting and clean boot hunting have not been included within the remit of this bill. Both practices are non-lethal forms of hunting, and it is my hope that those involved in fox hunting will adapt and move to these animal welfare-friendly alternatives. However, Deputy Speaker, it is vital that these two activities are not confused with trail hunting. I wish to emphasise trail hunting is not drag hunting and trail hunting is not clean boot hunting. Trail hunting, however, can be used as cover for illegal hunting, which is why it has been included within the remit of the bill. In fact, the exemptions in general have been written to avoid potential for loopholes, misinterpretation and uncertainty. In relation, Deputy Speaker, to penalties, I can inform the House that in setting the penalties, I have followed the highest penalty in Section 1 of the Welfare of Animals Act, Northern Ireland, 2011. A person who commits an offence under this Act is liable to a summary conviction to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 12 months, or to a fine not exceeding £20,000, or to both, and b, on conviction on indictment, to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years, or to a fine, or to both. It is my hope that we could scrutinise these penalties further at committee stage of the bill, including the potential forfeiture of any dog or hunting article which was used in the commissioning of the offence or was in the possession of the person convicted at the time of the arrest. Deputy Speaker, the interpretation section of the bill further defines the remit of the legislation, that it is an offence to organise or participate in the hunting of a wild mammal with a dog, and that all willing participants or those otherwise involved in the pursuit of a wild mammal will have caused an offence. In defining the offences, I have not included a clause for recklessness. Since trail hunting is to be prohibited, there is no need to extend this hunting offence to cover cases where a person who goes drag hunting is reckless and a live hunt ensues. And I have made the offences themselves one of strict liability, so that prosecution only has to prove the organisation or participation in hunting that I have mentioned already. Participation, Deputy Speaker, carries within its natural language a meaning of deliberate engagement or organisation of a hunt, which should in turn naturally exclude genuinely inadvertently stumbling across a hunt. Deputy Speaker, I am grateful today to present on the Hunting of Wild Mammals with Dogs Bill, and for debate on this matter, and for the opportunity that this can progress for further consideration and scrutiny. As members will be aware, I myself represent a largely rural constituency, and they will also be aware that before I joined this Assembly, I worked closely with the country sports sector for many years and tried to ensure that country sports and other outdoor activities were accessible to the public. The bill is not intended in any way to restrict traditional country sports such as shooting, using gun dogs or angling. The bill maintains appropriate balance by exempting hunting from the ban in certain circumstances, including avoiding damage to livestock, crops or property, and causing damage to the biological diversity of an area. It is therefore, Deputy Speaker, not my intention to go further than the scope of the bill as outlined in this content and as described today to Assembly colleagues. It is my hope that the clearly defined scope of the bill, to which I do not intend to add, is also good reason why the bill can be easily considered and consulted upon and debated in a timely manner within the time limits of the current Assembly mandate. Deputy Speaker, we have a historic opportunity to make a significant difference, a real opportunity here for Northern Ireland not only to catch up with the rest of the UK, but to lead the way in ensuring full, robust protection for animals persecuted for sport and for human enjoyment. I look forward, Deputy Speaker, to debating the principles of the bill with political colleagues, and I hope that they will give this legislation their backing, and that we can finally consign hunting with dogs to history where it belongs. I urge members to support. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I now call Declan McAleer, the Chairperson of the Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Committee.
I welcome this opportunity today to speak as Chairperson of the Committee for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, and to outline the views of the Committee on the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill. The Committee received evidence from the Bill's sponsor last Thursday and recognises that this is a contentious matter and that due consideration needs to be given to the issues before introducing such restrictions. The Committee heard that the purpose of the bill is to ban the use of use of dogs to hunt to death wild mammals that will include foxes, rabbits, deer, hare and mink, and that seeks to bridge a legislative gap here and other parts of these islands. However, the bill goes further by closing legislative loopholes that have been exploited by individuals who continue use of dogs to hunt under permissible activities. Clause 1 will make it an offence to participate in, organise the hunting of wild mammals with dogs, and the Committee acknowledges the use of dogs will invariably lead to a distress for hunted animals and potentially cause additional suffering. The Committee was advised that in order to bring forward a prosecution or penalty under the bill, there would be a threshold test to prove active participation and pursuit of a wild mammal using a dog. Members raised questions about this and were concerned that there may be insufficient safeguards to protect individuals who find themselves in a situation where their dog independently chases a wild mammal. Relatedly, members highlighted that Clause 6, which sets out how the Bill's provisions are to be interpreted, has a very wide scope and therefore could potentially lead to individuals engaging in appropriate activity being sanctioned, penalised or restricted unnecessarily. Clauses 2 and 3 of the Bill will ban the use of dogs in trail hunting and terrier work respectively. The committee heard that trail hunting, whereby a dog is induced to follow the scent of an animal by artificial or natural means, has been used in some areas by people to circumvent a ban on the use of dogs, and so it has been included in the Bill as a way of closing this gap. Terrier work, which involves the use of dogs underground to flush out a wild mammal, is likely to cause the hunted animal distress and so can be dangerous for the participating dog, with the risk of injury associated with operating underground. Clause 4 sets out exempted activities. The use of dogs to hunt rats and mice will be permissible. It will also be permissible to use dogs to hunt wild mammals if all of the following preconditions are met. The hunting is carried out to prevent damage to livestock, crops, property, or the biodiversity of an area, or to obtain meat for consumption. Each person who occupies the land on which the hunting will take place has given their consent. No more than 2 dogs are used. The wild mammal must be shot dead as soon as possible by a competent person. Members of the committee acknowledge that these criteria are broadly reflective of other laws, but considers that greater time and scrutiny would be required to explore these issues to determine their appropriateness. Clause 5 establishes the penalties that may be imposed through the Bill. An individual found to commit an offence may be subject to summary conviction, to imprisonment for up to 12 months and or a fine up to £20,000 and an indictment to a prison term of up to 5 years in addition to a possible fine. These penalties are similar to the provisions in other acts, but greater time and review is required to consider the proportionality of these penalties in the context of the very low conviction rates seen in England and Wales for similar breaches. The committee heard about the significant number of responses the Bill sponsor received to the consultation on the Bill and the strength of feeling from members of the public on this issue. Notwithstanding the commitment that the intent of the Bill is to ban hunting, not only the use of dogs in this activity, there is nevertheless a strong lobby that considers that hunting with dogs is an important economic and recreational outlet for rural areas, particularly in rural communities. The committee did not take a position on the Bill, but should it pass second stage today, we will engage with all the matters raised with the Bill's sponsor and various stakeholders. I just want to add on a comment from my perspective as the spokesperson for Sinn Féin for Agriculture and Rural Affairs. I want to say that Sinn Féin do not agree with a ban on hunting. However, there are elements of this bill that we do agree with. The legislation as it currently stands, we feel, is unworkable and would require significant additional time in the committee to rectify it, and that's time that we don't currently have, given the challenges of other legislation such as both the climate change bills. I have no doubt that this issue will be revisited in the next mandate when the appropriate time can be set aside to examine the issue in the round and to work alongside stakeholders to see what legislative changes are needed, if any. It's my view that the process will be best taken forward by the Department for Agriculture and Environment and Rural Affairs and the relevant minister in the next executive, in the first instance through a public consultation process.
Thank the member for giving way. I realise that the reference to committee business is a significant part of your position, but how many bills is the Derek Committee considering? I'm aware that the Health Committee, for example, is considering multiple bills at this stage. Surely that's a schedule that can be overcome if MLAs put their shoulder to the wheel. Thanks.
Well, member will be aware that we are currently both the Climate Change Acts bills are taking up the vast majority of the bandwidth of the committee at this present in time, and we're also dealing with the horse and racing bill and other important pieces of policy that are coming in. For example, the environmental and the new agriculture policy. And I think that this would require more in-depth and thorough scrutiny around this juncture in time to give it its due consideration. Thank you.
I call William Irwin.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to contribute to the debate and record my concerns on the unintended consequences of what amounts to, in my view, bad legislation. Representing a rural constituency, it is therefore no surprise that I have received hundreds of pieces correspondence from people who are deeply concerned by this poorly thought out bill, and I wish to see it taken off the table. These are responsible individuals who have taken time to explain to me their real concerns over the bill before this House today. It is my duty to represent those hundreds of people who have contacted me. These people who have raised their concerns and indeed draw immediate attention to the fact that practically every dog owner in the country whose dog may at some point chase a wild animal could indeed be committing an offence if this poorly thought out and ill-advised law were actually to come into force. This law is poorly drafted, and I know it has been raised, and that it has raised the concerns of many, and by its promotion, the bill's sponsor has, in my view, unfairly painted a picture of real life that is simply untrue. That is a regrettable byproduct of this bad legislation. As a farmer, I am in tune with the rural environment, and indeed I care greatly for the animals within my control. I do not at any time wish to see any animal suffer needlessly. Indeed, in my own farm, and indeed in many farms throughout the country, farmers spend heavily each year to ensure animals are healthy and well. They also spend heavily in maintaining healthy habitats for wildlife, which then has important knock-on benefits for the countryside. The control of vermin or pest species is an important part of the rural ecosystem. In order to maintain that, there are certain species which must be controlled and controlled effectively to ensure this important balance is kept. I believe this bill is the thin end of the wedge that we have seen with such attempts at legislation previously. Hunting, whilst not a pursuit that I engage in, is not the issue here. Rather, it is an attempt, in my view, to create a division and indeed misrepresent the rural community. Countryside Alliance, who have conducted a significant amount of research and consultation on this issue, make an important point around evidence and the fact that in this bill no attempt seems to have been made to examine the evidence. There is significant research and huge evidence base out there following similar exercises on the mainland, and it's worth considering that much of that evidence still points to a firm need to control vermin and pest species, and indeed that need will remain. Indeed, in Mr Blair's consultation, which has been the subject of much concern, there is a significant question mark over where our responses came from, whether they were from Northern Ireland or many responses generated possibly from overseas. The consultation only required an email address, and of course it is important that any consultation is focused on the views of the people here in Northern Ireland, not open to abuse through organised spam email. I remain concerned by the consultation process. The inclusion in this bill of 2-dog limit is a huge concern. It represents a real threat to how animals can be protected from vermin and pest species, and would create huge difficulties for farmers who have livestock susceptible to attack. This bill would drastically reduce the capacity to deal with such attacks on livestock and indeed manage game. Clause 6 of the bill is a huge concern, which would see a criminal offence committed if a dog, whilst out for a run with its owner, decided to chase a wild animal. The poorly constructed bill is concerningly open in its language in this area and will have serious implications for a wide range of scenarios, which as a simple day out in the country with your pet dog. It would also have implications for rough shooters, gamekeepers and pest controllers and indeed farmers. I say again, the bill is bad for the countryside and risks criminalising ordinary people. That surely cannot be allowed to happen in this day and age. Members, you simply cannot be oblivious to the ramifications of this bill and what it would mean in legal terms for the countryside and rural dwellers. You may not have an interest in hunting, but surely you have an interest in this House for creating laws that are sensible, logical and crucially enforceable. The bill before us does none of this. Should the bill progress, and I sincerely hope it does not, it would represent a very backward step and create an absolute legislative nightmare. The resource implications for the PSNI would be significant, and as we have seen in other areas, even in the mainland UK, the rate of enforcement is disproportionately low when compared to other offences. On the basis of what is before the House, I cannot support the bill given the concerning legal ramifications, and I urge the House to reject it.
I call Patsy McGlone.
Thanks very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I welcome the opportunity to debate this issue today, and I thank the member for affording us the opportunity. The SDLP, in terms of our own party, is deeply committed to animal welfare and the prevention of abuse of animals, and that abusers do and should correctly carry the consequences. A lot of work has been done in this regard by my colleague Dolores Kelly, with Sinead Bradley and myself, and indeed Councillor Malachy Quinn, in relation to the register of offenders. I have, and I lay my cards on the table here, I'm one of those people who engage in country sports, not hunting with dogs as the likes of this here, but I'm one of those people, those 54,000 people who have a firearms certificate for that purpose. And and John already knows this, my concern, and it's not a flippant or an aside concern, my concern is a major one, and that's with the interpretation of 6, the final provisions interpretation. And I read it into the record. The reference in this Act to the hunting of a wild mammal with a dog includes any case where a wild mammal is pursued by one or more persons and one or more dogs are employed in that pursuit. That's the draft legislation. That's as proposed at this stage within this bill. Now, what does that mean? What that means is, where I come from, it's not unusual, mostly on a Saturday morning, to see a group of people out with their dogs and with their shotguns, either after pheasants or on their way to the duck pond or on their way to Loch Ness, to carry out what is a very legitimate and approved activity. And indeed, I would have to place on record here that many of those people are among the most law-abiding that there are, because they do not want anything to jeopardise their sport or their retention of their shotgun or whatever it may be that they have with the firearms certificate. Now, under this legislation, and the Chairman has already referred to it, about facing imprisonment for a term not exceeding 12 months and facing a fine up to £20,000. Now, I paint the picture, go back to that Saturday morning where that group of people are going out pheasant shooting, whatever it may be, and the dogs that they have, who are specially bred for that purpose, they're good dogs, spaniels, whatever it might be, those dogs get the scent of a wild mammal, and they are off in pursuit of that wild mammal, and the owners are after them to try and restrain the dogs, get the dog back so they can get them to the destination that they're going to. Meantime, a police officer is observing this activity. According to the draft of what we have in front of us here, that police officer observes, obviously, an organised group of people who are, at that stage that police officer observes them, are in the act of hunting a wild mammal with dogs, which includes in any case where a wild mammal is pursued by one or more persons and one or more dogs are employed in that pursuit. Sure,
Deputy Speaker, I thank the member for giving way. I want to make 2 points that perhaps he could clarify. I think he's fairly clearly outlined so far he doesn't have a major difficulty with dealing with some of the elements of the bill that deal with the most brutal of country sports and barbaric of country sports. But in relation to the legislative challenges, and maybe he could clarify the position of fox hunting, for example. But in relation to the legislative position and the intervention, if such a thing happened by the police, can I ask him, is that not exactly what happens currently with legislation that's designed to protect badgers, for example, where a dog innocently or instinctively followed the scent of a badger? Then that set of circumstances already exists, and as far as I'm aware, no one has been prosecuted on that basis. And secondly, in relation to the police, is it not quite simply that could also be applied to the situation with badgers, and thus far nothing has happened, and also we have to trust the police to make that judgment at the time? And other allegations against anyone in holding a firearms certificate may also have implications for them, not simply this.
Thank you very much indeed for that intervention. There is but one difference between the badger and some of these other mammals. The badger is largely a nocturnal animal, and people generally don't be out with dogs at that time of the night. Well, yes, but okay.
I appreciate the member giving way. Surely the issue is intent, and the law is clear that if people intend to pursue wild mammals, the issue is clearly about intent. there's no, I see no scenario, if this bill passes, I see no scenario where innocent people end up hauled in front of a court over an accident of their dog, picking up the scent and following it. It is clear that the bill is about the intent of pursuit of wild mammals.
I get what the member is saying, but if a police officer observes people, a group of people, with a group of dogs, and those dogs are in pursuit of a wild mammal, the police officer is duty-bound to assess that situation, be it rightly or wrongly, as they see it at that moment in time. Now, just allow me to expand on that, and I'm sure other members have dealt with people here who have got into problems, alleged or perceived or otherwise, with firearm certificates. Now, the implication of that is not only under, as I read the interpretation of this legislation, not only are they facing difficulties and possibly prosecution under this legislation, caught in that scenario by a police officer or officers, but they're doing so while in possession of a firearm. So, one is animal welfare, the other is quite clearly illegal use of a firearm, as it would be seen. Now, the consequences of that, and I have to say this in the context of the bill that we have here, are immediately, for a serious offence such as animal welfare, their guns are scooped, their shotguns are scooped, they're taken by the police and taken into safe holding. Now, and I know we've had a discussion, myself and Mr Blair, about this, and those issues can be left to be rectified by the Public Prosecution Service. From the initial guns being scooped until we all know legalities in the law and how it works, from statements being prepared by police, from those statements being passed to the Public Prosecution Service, and from that Public Prosecution Service actually delivering a decision, can take 12, 18, 24 months. With COVID over this last while, it has taken incredibly longer. Now, my point being is, even at that point of the Public Prosecution Service having made a decision to say, no prosecution here, at that point, the decision is not left to the Public Prosecution Service to return that person's firearm. The decision is left to Firearms and Explosives Branch, who can decide, based on what evidence they have, including the statements of police officers, whether that person is a fit person to return the firearm to. Now, that's the process. I've gone through it with many people over the years, and it's a fair indication as to how things can go, especially when this happens. Now, that brings me on to, and some of the legal, I have to pay tribute here, has just arrived this morning. Some of the legal aspects of this have been, the concerns around this have been raised by BASC, which is the British Association for Shooting and Conservation. Some detailed advice has come from a legal person around this. Now, my point being is, in that intervening 12, 14, 18 months, how long as it might be to arrive for the PPS to make a decision on this matter and FEB to return the gun. Yep, thank you, I'll wind up now. My point being is that that person's occupation, if they're an occupation which is sensitive, say veterinary surgeon, police officer even, probation officer, anyone in social services, their boss may be calling them in and saying, here, I hear you're being investigated for a very serious offence. Now, those are the issues that really need to be addressed around this, around that interpretation. And I appreciate Mr Blair having listened to us on Thursday whenever we raised these issues, and again on Thursday evening with the party. But I have serious concerns about, I don't dispute they're not intended consequences, but about the unintended consequences of the interpretation under Clause 6. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I hope I've made the time framework there.
Now call Rosemary Barton. And can I advise the member that I may have to interrupt as we're approaching question time at 2 p.m.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'll try and keep within the time limits for the opportunity to speak to this second stage debate this afternoon. Presently, Northern Ireland has no dedicated and specific legislation banning or regulating the hunting of mammals with dogs, unlike current legislation within England, Scotland and Wales, where hunting with dogs is either restricted or banned. We do, however, have legislation whose objective is to protect wildlife, such as the 2011 Wildlife and Natural Environment Northern Ireland Act, which prohibited hare coursing, but still permitted the possibility to hunt wild animals. There is also legislation in place to deal with the issue of attacks on people, livestock and other animals. While there are many that would debate that hunting with dogs is a necessity to keep predators like foxes under control, others would contend that this method of control is very cruel and causes unnecessary suffering before the animal dies. There are more humane, swifter methods of eradicating predators, such as foxes, that are a danger to young lambs and free-range fowl and ground nesting birds. In considering this bill today, we must remember that its aim is the introduction of a ban on the hunting wild mammals to death with dogs. This is a short bill with 10 clauses, but there are several that need greater clarification as to what the intention of the legislation is.
I'm grateful to Mrs Barton for giving way. At the second stage, what we consider is the general principles of the bill, and then the further clarification that members wish can be provided at further stages. But can we all agree, as a general principle, that the hunting of a wild mammal to death with a pack of dogs is cruel and unnecessary?
Yes, that's what I've already said. Yes, indeed. In Clause 1, it is an offence to organise or participate in hunting. There is no clear definition as to what a participant is. Is this an individual on horseback out for a hack with their pet dogs, someone out in a country walk and their dog chasing a rabbit? In Clause 2, Part 2, again this is ambiguous by suggesting that trail hunting means any process in which one or more dogs are induced or permitted to follow the scent of a wild animal. A landowner walking across his or her fields with their dogs off a leash, who suddenly pick up on the scent of a wild mammal and give chase, must be protected. One cannot prevent the hunting instincts of a pet. I would also have concern that the current wording of the bill would end drag hunting. This allows the pursuits by dogs following an artificial scent. Drag hunting could also allow horse riders who formerly hunted to continue to meet, socialise and enjoy the countryside. In Clause 3, Part 2, terrier work refers to a process in which dogs are induced to enter a hole. However, there are other animals who also could be induced to enter a hole in the ground to force out a wild animal. Wild mammal to leave its hole. Is this permissible, as wild animals may have the same ending? Clause 4, Part 3, A and 3B, clarification is needed on the definition of serious damage. This is an evidential threshold. How is the damage measured? In Clause 4, Part 3, is this the stalking of wild mammals for animal food? Clarification is also needed. In Clause 6, Part 1, again we have ambiguity. If several people are out for a walk, or even the landowner and his family, who have several pet dogs along with them, and they become involved in the pursuit of a rabbit, an amendment needs to be added to ensure that ordinary pet owners in Northern Ireland are not criminalised by this bill. In conclusion, if this bill was to become legislation and hunts come to an end, consideration needs to be given to compensation for those men and women losing their jobs. Also, consideration needs to be given to the hounds that are specifically kept to accompany hunts. These animals are not pets, and therefore there is limited opportunities for them to become house pets. Further, will many of these hunt horses also be retired? What is their future? Mr Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I am content for the bill to pass this stage, but a lot of work is required on a number of clauses and assurances, given that alternative methods of eradicating what the agricultural community refer to as predators addresses the protection issues of farm livestock and also is not a hindrance to biodiversity.
Members, question time is due to commence at 2 p.m. I would ask, therefore, that members take their ease until then. We now return to the second stage debate of the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill, and I call Harvey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The private member's bill before us today represents without doubt an attempt to address what is a very emotive issue for many. I am sure that, like me, members across the chamber have been dealing with a huge amount of mail and have been engaging with constituents from both sides of the debate. Since the bill was first drafted, at the outset, I would say personally that I very much sympathise with the intent of the bill. I am not a hunting man, and the activity has never appealed to me in any shape or form, especially in terms of it being for entertainment purposes. That said, however, I know many for whom it does, and I also know the benefits that flow from the activity, both for those involved and also for our rural communities more widely. It is no secret, for instance, whether we as individuals like it or not, that the hunting of mammals using dogs has been a method of pest control employed by farmers for centuries. The Ulster Farmers Union and other organisations have drawn attention to that fact that the fox population requires constant management due to the danger they present to the domestic poultry flocks and lambs especially. The member for South Antrim has raised alternative methods for fox control, such as fox-proof fencing, ultrasonic pest devices, or artificial scents which deter foxes. These are likely to be considered impractical by farmers in Northern Ireland, and various representations have already been made to me by those within the sector on this point. In any event, it could be assumed that landowners would be seeking government support for the funding of alternative methods for fox management should the bill be enacted. It is perhaps worth bearing in mind that hunting with hounds is not seen as a major activity in Northern Ireland. There are relatively small numbers of hunt groups who operate within NI, and those engaged in the activity usually have long-held family connections with it. Hunts are currently regulated both by the few registered bodies who conduct them, but also by external factors. For example, hunts only gain access to farmland with the consent of individual farmers and landowners. This means that landowners are able to decide their own position on the hunt and its place in the countryside and regulate usage accordingly. Many will be aware that the Ulster Farmers Union has a long-standing memorandum of understanding with the Countryside Alliance and the Northern Ireland Masters of the Hounds Association, meaning problems can be raised by landowners and rectified quickly through legitimate bodies. Opponents of the bill argue that it raises more questions than answers. It will be for the member, working in conjunction with the committee, to seek to address some of the practicalities that will be faced by the rural community. Attempts have been made within this bill to close several of the loopholes which have been evidenced in England and Wales since similar legislation was enacted some 15 years ago, which is to be welcomed. However, even with the inclusion of a ban on trail hunting, it is difficult to see how future breaches could be identified and addressed. Similarly, issues with the scope of the proposed legislation have also been highlighted. I note that the members previously pointed to the threshold of organised use for human entertainment as being an effective tool in limiting the scope of the bill and ensuring it doesn't become so encompassing as to include the one man and his dogs of the lead analogy. I remain to be convinced as to the viability of the legal practicalities of this point, however. I know that many within our rural communities have serious concerns about any future impact the bill could have on other countryside activities, including shooting and pest control, for instance. Issues have been raised in relation to the efficiency of the consultation process, and I have to acknowledge my own concerns with the process and the results received. I appreciate that the consultation was conducted in accordance with the usual Assembly procedures, but I feel the lack of data from respondents has severely weakened the consultation. I firmly believe that this is an issue that the Assembly needs to consider more widely. The potential for consultations to be manipulated by lobby groups from elsewhere around the world due to the lack of data supplied by respondents in terms of their address, for example, is something that I believe we need to close down moving forward. The motives behind the bill can be understood. However, little detail has been supplied in terms of the benefits, or more importantly, the facts which the legislation will likely create for those standing to be most affected. For example, in terms of jobs lost for gamekeepers or those responsible for the breeding and training of dogs, it should also be noted that it is not just DAERA who may have a role in this legislation. Input from the Department of Justice, including the PSNI, and also the Department for Communities, will likely be required if a workable piece of legislation is to be achieved. Pressures will undoubtedly be placed upon police resources to enforce future legislation in this area when considered against other priorities such as rural crime, and I would urge members to bear enforcement issues in mind during their deliberations. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I hope to engage constructively with the bill when it reaches committee and will be happy to do so. However, I will not be supporting the bill before us today. That said, I acknowledge the genuine intent of the member, and on a personal level, I wish him well on his endeavours. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Christopher Stalford.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Sir, I stand to support the bill and the provisions contained therein. It is to me astonishing that in 2021 the practice of hunting foxes with hounds and other wild mammals should be continued to be practised in this country. I wasn't always of the view that I am now on this issue. I very much took the view I'm a town person, and it wasn't for me to tell people in the countryside how to live and how to operate. And then my mind was changed, and I'm going to regale the House. My mind was changed following an incident, I think it was in Newry, where children were playing in the garden with a new puppy that their mother had bought for them, and the hunt tore into their garden, ripped their puppy to bits in front of them, and one child asked one of the people on horseback, "Mister, is our puppy dead?" He picked up a bit of the puppy, flung it over a hedge, and said to those children, "Looks like it, doesn't it?" Now, if that's the byproduct, if that's the indirect consequence of a practice like this, then it has no place in our society. Leaving aside the direct cruelty, that was an indirect consequence of it. Leaving aside the direct cruelty of hunting with hounds, hunting mammals with hounds, it's also unnecessary. And I don't take a sentimental view about foxes. I accept the arguments that foxes are vermin. I'm not taking some sentimental view on this issue, but there are other ways to deal with a fox problem if you have one. You don't need to make a sport out of it. You don't need dozens of people on horseback tearing across the countryside, and in many cases, damaging the countryside, damaging fences and things like that. You don't need dozens of people on horseback tearing across the countryside with a pack of dogs to deal with the problem. That's sport. That's not pest control. So let's call it what it is. I don't even think it's sport, but let's call it what it is. There's been a lot of obfuscation in this debate thus far. Firstly, Mr. Blair has been attacked on the basis of the consultation, and the consultation wasn't thorough enough, or the consultation didn't ask the right questions, or lobby groups were able to influence the consultation. Well, I can share with members then, some will recall, in the, not the most recent general election, but the one before, a suggestion was raised that the Conservative Party, if they formed a majority, would reverse the Hunting Act. An opinion poll was carried out on that, and 85% of people surveyed were against the repeal of the Hunting Act. So the idea that there's some silent majority out there that is in favour of the maintenance of hunting with hounds, that's just nonsense. It's not borne out by any measure at all of public opinion. The majority of citizens want hunting abolished in this country. Happy to.
Thank the member for giving way, and I know he has a particular opinion on this bill. So I could ask the member, he will realise that one of the most controversial aspects is Clause 2, which is the ban of trail hunting. Could I ask the member, does he know the difference between trail hunting and drag hunting? One to be made illegal in this bill and the other to be kept legal. And if he does, could he explain to the House how indeed the police could differentiate?
Well, if the member wishes to include it in the bill, I'm happy to vote for that too. If the member wishes to have it included in the bill, I'm happy to vote for that too. I think the recent decision taken by the National Trust in relation to trail and drag hunting, demonstrated, and the recent High Court judgment on this matter demonstrated, that trail hunting is used as a cover for the hunting of wild mammals. And everyone, member would cease chuntering from a sedentary position. You'll have your turn. And the fact is that the National Trust took the decision that they took because they recognised that trail and drag hunting was being used as a cover for the hunting of wild mammals with dogs. I don't accept the premise, I don't accept for 1 second the premise that this is a town versus country argument. It is not. There are many, many people who live in rural communities who are as opposed to the hunting with hounds of wild mammals as I am. And the attempt by, talk about lobbying groups, powerful lobbying groups, Countryside Alliance and other groups like that, the attempt to portray it as ignorant townies versus ignorant city slickers imposing their will on country people is simply not the case. The majority of people, whether they live in towns or they live in the city, are with me on this issue in opposing the continuance of this cruel and unnecessary practice. I welcome the content of the clause. I welcome the clauses, particularly in relation to terrier work. I just see no purpose in that, no reason in that, for that sort of activity to be going on. So, just finally, in the course of the debate, someone mentioned possibly the troubles with enforcement. That logic appears to be: don't pass a bill, don't pass a law for fear that you're going to have to enforce it. Well, that's what a legislative assembly exists for. It exists to pass laws. It exists where we see practices that we wish to end, to be ended, and also where we want to initiate new initiatives to initiate them. But this is a practice that should be ended, and I'll be supporting the bill.
I now call Chris Lyttle, and for the benefit of members, can remind members that the maximum contribution is 15 minutes. There is no limit to the length of the overall debate, but any individual contribution is 15 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to speak in support of the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill, as proposed by my Alliance Party colleague John Blair MLA, which gives every MLA in this Assembly the opportunity to stand up for animal welfare and to ban hunting with dogs in Northern Ireland. The pursuit and kill of wild mammals by hunting dogs for the purpose of enjoyment is cruel and unnecessary. Quick kills are rare, and many animals do suffer a prolonged chase and painful death. No animal should be chased to the point of exhaustion or rupturing of organs to then be ripped to shreds by a pack of hounds pursuing it. This is blood sport, Deputy Speaker, and a practice that should be consigned to history where it belongs. Deputy Speaker, Northern Ireland is the only part of the United Kingdom without a ban on hunting with dogs, despite widespread public support for a ban. And I commend my Alliance Party colleague John Blair MLA for introducing this bill to the Assembly, which will reform legislation on hunting wild mammals with dogs in Northern Ireland if MLAs give it an opportunity to do so, and bring our legislation in line with that of other jurisdictions where the practice has been illegal for nearly 20 years. I note the 18,000 strong response to the public consultation, which had 78% support for the proposals, which must be unprecedented and indeed a remarkable consultation response by any assessment. I note there has also been widespread public support and indeed some political backing for the introduction of a ban on fox hunting in Ireland. Indeed, it was my understanding that Sinn Féin Party President Mary Lou MacDonald had set out quite clearly an intention for Sinn Féin to vote in favour of a ban on fox hunting at the earliest opportunity. That opportunity, Deputy Speaker, is presented by this bill today. I would also commend campaigners such as Janice Watt of the League Against Cruel Sports for her tireless work on the issue of animal welfare. She has suffered her own bereavement recently and health challenges, and has been no less strident in her support as a result of those challenges. And I know she watches on today, and I commend her for all the work that she has done in relation to animal welfare over the years and in support of this specific proposal today. Deputy Speaker, a ban on hunting with dogs in Northern Ireland is long overdue. It is cruel and unnecessary and causes the hunted animal immeasurable suffering, whether or not it is eventually killed. As public representatives, we have the responsibility to legislate for the people of Northern Ireland, and it is indisputable that the majority of the public are opposed to hunting with dogs and deem the practice completely unacceptable. It is an issue that I have consistently been contacted on by my constituents in East Belfast, which has seen some of the most horrific incidents of animal cruelty in Northern Ireland. There is strong support for this proposal from the people of East Belfast, and I'm glad to be able to speak in relation to that today. Deputy Speaker, many political parties seek to position themselves as in support of animal welfare. Well, this is a clear opportunity to demonstrate that support today. The task, as has been mentioned by other MLAs at second stage, is to set out your position on the principles of the bill, a ban on cruel and unnecessary hunting. Deputy Speaker, I don't think any MLA or party can vote against, or make progress, can vote against the principles of this bill at second stage today and legitimately claim to support the principle of a hunting ban. Deputy Speaker, I also think any MLA or party that does vote against the principle of this bill today can expect their support for animal welfare to be legitimately challenged hereafter. And I would encourage all MLAs and parties to carefully consider the import of allowing this bill to at least pass to committee stage today. That is the task before MLAs, after all. As the proposer stated, Deputy Speaker, we have a historic opportunity to make a significant difference to animal welfare in Northern Ireland and to lead the way in ensuring full, robust protection for our animals persecuted for sport and human enjoyment. I ask all MLAs to support the progression of this legislation to a committee stage and ultimately to end brutality against animals and consign hunting with dogs to history where it belongs. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I call Jonathan Buckley.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I begin at the start by placing on record my membership of the all-party group on country sports. There will be under no illusion. I speak here on this issue today as a representative MLA and a keen conservationist and country sports enthusiast. During my lifetime, I've had the opportunity to meet huntsmen and huntswomen, conservationists, from Antrim to Kerry, from Down to Donegal and everywhere in between. Hunting and countryside management has been an intrinsic part of the rural way of life across these islands for many, many years. I hope during the time that I've afforded to me today that I can correct some of the vile attempted character assassinations on many within the hunting community. And can I thank both the Countryside Alliance and indeed Basque and many others for their engagement with me on this bill. The reasons for proposing legislation on the lines of the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill appears to be as vague as they are misguided. Has the member not witnessed the turmoil that has taken place in England, Wales and Scotland as a result of the two laws that seek to ban hunting with dogs? Something that is still not fully resolved these many years later. Has he not listened to judges, legal experts, veterinarians, senior police officers, animal welfare experts, senior civil servants, countless country people, as well as the Prime Minister of the day that shares a name, all of whom have criticised these laws? Does he casually dismiss the view of the Senior Parliamentary Council, who was asked to draft the Hunting Act 2004, when he said, all government legislation ought to be about pursuing a public policy that the party in government is pursuing because it forms part of their policies for the betterment of the state? But this wasn't that. A moral judgment is being imposed on a minority, and I thought we didn't do that, except in the extremists. Does the vast cost to the taxpayer in police and court time not make him think again about following this path? Or does he believe that because an opinion poll that supports his bill, a poll, I may add, in which literally anyone, anywhere in the world could take part in, and has received a paltry 18,000 responses, that this is the sound basis for enacting legislation? I mean, I personally seen responses from as far away as Arizona, United States of America, and other European cities. Do they understand the unique circumstances and nature of the Northern Ireland countryside? I would ask members to think on that point. To argue that a ban on the use of hunting dogs is somehow justified simply because the rest of the United Kingdom has enacted similar disastrous laws is as pointless as it is ill-founded. We should be learning from the mistakes other parts of the United Kingdom has made, not blindly following for some dubious virtue-signalling reason. However, it has to be said that the legislators here in Northern Ireland did in fact have this issue resolved many years ago, when legislation protecting animal welfare and the right to hunt coexisted. The law permitted the prosecution of anyone, including hunt supporters, if unnecessary suffering to an animal had been caused. So it is highly significant that during those years, not one prosecution was brought forward. It has been argued by indeed the Alliance Party and others that this was because the legislation was flawed. But how? If the evidence of unnecessary suffering had existed, such as what we have heard today from some in this House, there would have been no bar to legal action. Could it be, and I dare to suggest, that the scientific and veterinary evidence against hunting with dogs simply does not exist? Indeed, I know some members might not like to hear this, but the veterinary evidence is in support of hunting. I can confirm and inform the Chamber that the Veterinary Association for Wildlife Management states, and I quote, "Hunting is the natural and most humane method of controlling the fox population. It is humane for a number of reasons. Perhaps the most important is that it is intrinsically certain and leaves no wounded survivors. Hunting with scented hounds adheres perfectly to the aims of genuine wildlife management, leaving a quarry population smaller but healthier, and achieving this in a way that is both natural for the hunter and the hunted." The bill before us, members, ignores all of these points and, quite frankly, is so poorly drafted that under it, every dog owner in Northern Ireland could become a potential criminal. A criminal for simply letting their dogs do what dogs do. In other words, members, this bill attempts to legislate against a dog's most basic and natural instinct, that being to scent and to hunt. The bill also ignores peer-reviewed research that shows flushing foxes to guns using a full pack of hounds is actually more effective than using just 2 dogs, as the Hunting Act in England and Wales demands. It is a point emphasised by the Law Lord Bonamy in 2016 when he commissioned the Scottish Government review into the law there. understanding why limiting this process to just 2 dogs was ever thought to be better than 3 or 4 or perhaps a pack of dogs is unclear. There is certainly no scientific or veterinary basis for that number, apart from the very obvious fact that it curbs the use of hounds. Dogs are used in a variety of country sports, and the member has said that he has no desire to stop any other activity than that is the killing of wild mammals by dogs, and I take his sincere point on that. But this bill, as drafted, bears no relation to that promise. Shooting will be affected through the work of gamekeepers and dogs that are used in numerous ways in other sports. The bill seeks to ban trail hunting, a point that I was trying to raise to my colleague and friend, Mr. Stalford. Quite how the police will be expected to distinguish between the different types of scent used by a legal drag hunt and an illegal trail hunt is anyone's guess. And I haven't heard that point explained here in the House today. I now speak directly to members and indeed country sports enthusiasts across Northern Ireland. Today, by means of this bill, the anti-hunting lobby seek to ban the huntsman and woman and their hound. Next, it will be the gunman and gunwoman with their dog, followed by the angler and their rod. And I suspect that may not be the intention of Mr. Blair, as I have realised, but I can assure this House that it is indeed the very intention of some of the advocates behind this bill. I mean, the only reason that the rat, the common rat, the vermin, has been excluded from this bill is because it wasn't frankly deemed cute and cuddly enough to be excluded. It didn't fit the narrative. But we as members must do what's right. We as members must look at this legislation and deem, is it fit for purpose? If the principle behind this bill is that sport or recreation has no place in the management of wildlife, then clearly shooting, falconry and angling will be all on the list for banning at some time in the near future. Make no mistake. But I come to an important point. All that I have said up to now would be diminished or indeed irrelevant if the welfare of those animals that were previously hunted in England, in Wales and in Scotland had actually been improved. Yet, in all the significant sums of money that has been spent in campaigning for laws to ban hunting and subsequent costs to the public purse in both police and court time, not a single penny, not one, has been spent by any anti-hunting group to assess the impact of these laws. That in itself, Mr. Deputy Speaker, speaks volumes. Surely such critical and crucial research would put an end to the hunting controversy once and for all. Or do these groups suspect what is really happening to the wild animals they supposedly care for and realise that the case is fundamentally flawed? Such evidence that we do have indicates that the previously hunted species in many areas now are viewed very differently by farmers and landowners, with the result that a community-based conservation process has now become one of just pest control, often with healthy animals being killed instead of the weak, the injured or the diseased, and now in far greater numbers. This is not a productive way of wildlife managing. This, again, is virtue signalling. The hunting bans in the rest of the United Kingdom are not only detrimental to animal welfare, they are also damaging to conservation. I can well understand, members, why the public, which in the main is unfamiliar with hunting and might not like the idea of the activity, and members in this House may not, will sign petitions or respond negatively to public opinion polls, but such surveys only reflect a perception, and these surveys do not explain other methods of wildlife management or pest control that would inevitably increase and which the public would find equally offensive. The job of an MLA is to analyse the issues in detail, study the bill in detail, and legislate on the basis of evidence and fact, not prejudice or perception. Members, I support legitimate, law-abiding hunting activity. I equally support, and you won't say shame to this point, Mr. Stalford, I equally support robust police action against those who partake in illegal forms of hunting, and such as the example that you noted in your contribution, I can tell you this, that law-abiding hunts, men and women across this country, equally condemn it in full measure. This does not have to be a debate in which one side can win and the other side lose. That's a situation where certain campaigning groups want us to be. I will if I have time at the end. Yep. There will always be people on each side of the argument who never agree, never see the opposing point of view, and will never compromise. But I feel these are two minority groups. The vast majority of people on both sides feel strongly about animal welfare, but also realise that wild animals need to be controlled and that this must and should be in the most humane ways possible. This bill would seriously restrict the ability to manage wild animals, whilst doing absolutely nothing for animal welfare. I would therefore urge colleagues to vote against this bill. If we need to address the issue in the future, as I have mentioned, there has been times in past when this Assembly and this place has got this right, that we do so on the basis of evidence and principle, with the certain aim, collective aim, of addressing animal welfare rather than controlling human behaviour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Dolores Kelly.
Deputy Speaker, and I thank the private member for introducing this bill. And like my colleague, Patsy McGlone, I rise in support of the bill. The SDLP has had a policy of wanting to ban fox hunting from 1995. And I know that, as many have said here, the primary objective of this bill is to stop fox hunting as a sport. And yes, I will.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Earlier in the debate, reference was made to an organisation called the Veterinary Association for Wildlife Management. Sounds benign, doesn't it? What we weren't told was that the previous name of said group was Vets for Hunting.
Well, I appreciate the member for clarifying that point, and I know that in his very impassioned contribution to the debate, Mr Buckley said around no winners or losers. Well, quite frankly, there will be winners. Winners in terms of very many wild mammals that will no longer be torn to shreds by dogs. And I think I, for one, and I'm sure the vast majority of people who have been quoted quite often during this debate, don't actually need much scientific evidence or research to be conducted to know that there is inhumane and cruel. You know, I just don't think we need to know that. And it is interesting, you know, that many people talking about coming out of COVID, you know, we're talking about building a kinder society, kinder to each other, and obviously, hopefully, kinder to nature because of the climate challenge, and also kinder to our animals by controlling and preventing this type of sport. I know that Patsy McGlone outlined that we had met with the sponsor of the bill only last week and had raised a couple of areas over which we sought further clarification. And as a party are keen to work with the sponsor of the bill in looking at some minor amendments, particularly around Clause 6, around the interpretation and the outworkings, or if you like, the unintended consequences potentially in some of the points within Clause 6. And some of that is around, you know, well, what if a third dog joins the rampage, if you like, or if indeed a farmer doesn't have a gun and that sends dogs off to chase foxes away from the sheep. What happens then? Do all farmers have then to be carrying firearm certificates or not? So, Mr Deputy Speaker, much has already been said in relation to the bill. I just want to be very clear that the SDLP is supportive of the intent of this bill. There are a few areas around which we want to seek further clarification, and we look forward to working with the member at committee stage in bringing forward or supporting his amendments to the bill on those points of clarification. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I call Peter Weir.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is clear that the issue of hunting, indeed broadly speaking, animal welfare, animal cruelty issues, do cut across different sectors of society. There are people from a Unionist background, a nationalist background on both sides of the argument. Indeed, possibly if I'm interpreting the last speaker correctly, herself and the previous representative from the SDLP would be on a different page, in the same way as probably I'd be a different page from the previous speaker from the DUP. It is also the case, I think, that even in terms of there's not a uniformity of position amongst country people or townies, as it may be classified. There are those who would come from an urban background who would be quite supportive of hunting. There are others from a rural background who would be quite hostile, and vice versa on that basis. And even, I suspect, within the broader veterinary community, there will be differences of opinion within that. Can I indicate, I suppose, that was, I think, displayed, those who I think were members of the House at that stage, back, I think, about 11 years ago, when, indeed, I think in the previous pieces of legislation, we had a division, and indeed it cut across different party perspectives on the issue of hare coursing, which this House voted by a majority to ban. I remember, I think, having an exchange with Mr Boylan, who was representative then, who was in support of hare coursing. I was, indeed, remain opposed to hare coursing. And indeed, for want of any doubt, I am opposed to hunting. I remain opposed to hunting. I will be supporting the bill today. I speak as well as someone who is a former chair of the all-party group on animal welfare. And mention has been made about not testing out, if you like, whether or not this is in the welfare of the animals concerned. Well, again, without stating, I suppose, the obvious, I think if I was able to avoid getting chased across the field by a pack of dogs, I think possibly my welfare would be somewhat improved. And I think that therefore, I think we can draw a level of conclusion there as well. I would, well, I'll not give way, but I'm going to praise, I think, one of the remarks that the previous speaker, Mr Buckley, had made. He is right in terms of the fact that, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the controversy around this issue for a very long period of time, there are people who feel very passionately about this issue, and there's probably minorities on both sides of this who would take a very extreme view. And what it tends to lead in those circumstances, either opponents or proponents, will mean that at times there's a level of overreach, that sometimes supporters of a bill such as this will perhaps make claims for it which don't necessarily follow through. And sometimes opponents of this will overemphasise particular aspects of this, will see demons within it that are not necessarily there. So I think it's important when we look at the bill, and perhaps as a starting point, before we get on to the direct principles of the bill, to maybe indicate some things that are not in the bill. Firstly, I would concur that I think, while I would be on a different page from many of them, there are many, many people who are involved in country sports who are very strongly, some of the strongest conservationists in this country, who play a very important role within that. And I freely acknowledge that, I freely support that indeed. As I'm sure before he reminds me, I recently...
Order. Could I encourage the member to use the microphone so that Hansard has a clear record of what he's saying?
I would hate to think any of my words for posterity were lost, Mr Deputy Speaker, so thank you for the reminder of that. Can I say, yes, I think there is that strong contribution of those from a country sports background to conservation, to biodiversity. So in supporting this bill, I make no impugning of their honour. Similarly, in terms of what is within this bill, I think that even some of us that are supporters of this bill, as is almost inevitably with any drafted bill, would acknowledge that in terms of every precise element of it is not perfect. I think the previous speaker indicated that, I think, as is the way of such things, that if this reaches the point at which it progresses to the next stage, I would question possibly, I I'm judging the mood of this House may not necessarily give it a majority today, but we shall see. But if it reaches the next stage, that is the opportunity to both interrogate the bill and also perhaps to make changes to it. I have to say one of the issues which was raised, and I maybe I'll address this particularly to the proposer of the bill, has been the issue, I think, raised particularly by Mr McGlone on the set of circumstances in terms of Article 6 of the bill. And indeed, there has been a fairly consistent indication of correspondence from those who are opponents to this bill, suggesting that those who, for example, would be out walking their dogs, the dogs go off the leash and involves itself in some sort of activity chasing a mammal, and would that criminalise the people concerned? I don't believe that is the intention of this bill, and I don't believe it is there, I think, in the wording of the bill. However, I think it is important that if that is a consideration which is of concern, that there is clarification put within that. And so I would ask the bill sponsor whether, if it reaches that consideration stage, that he would be willing to see and support amendments to the bill to tie this in with an intention to hunt or wilfully hunting. And I don't know whether the sponsor wants to comment at this stage or whether he wishes to do that in the wind, but I'm happy to give way.
To Mr Weir, Deputy Speaker, for giving way. I can give Mr Weir an assurance. In fact, this is hopefully going to shorten my winding speech at the end if I can address a number of points now at the one time. I can give, through you, Deputy Speaker, an assurance that I am happy to look at and work with others in relation to the Section 6 of the bill and the terminology around willing participation, numbers of dogs, and the inclusion of the word willing there might well make a difference.
And certainly from that point of view, I welcome the clarification, but certainly I think for a number of us that would be supporting the bill, if this reaches the consideration stage, that would be the type of amendment that we would see. Indeed, if the bill sponsor doesn't bring forward such an amendment, I think others will. Well, I'm trying to get through, so I'll give way briefly.
Which Mr Blair does the member think we should listen to? The one who's just spoken, or the one who told the Agricultural Committee that I have made the offences themselves one of strict liability, so prosecution only has to prove the organisation of or participation in the hunting? It clearly is a strict liability offence. That's the principle he's put into the bill, and that's the principle that the member is now asking him to resile from. And
the point within that is this House will have the opportunity to make changes to it, and certainly I think, while I would be question whether there's necessarily a majority in this House even for the second reading, there would be a very clear majority for those sort of changes. The member mentions which Mr Blair should we listen to. I mean, in terms of actually one of the advocates, apparently, of the concerns over the position in England, I know the previous member quoted Tony Blair. I think I'm correct in saying that he had now concerns about the legal position. I do have to say I'd be a little bit worried whenever somebody brings Tony Blair in as an advocate in defence of a particular position. I'm concerned that largely speaking the case is made on the other side, perhaps. Some of us have had that level of experience. It is also the case that in terms of the what has been put before us, mention has been made. I think one of the other arguments, this is the thin end of the wedge, it is something which there will be, I'm sure, some people who would want to see this much more widened, but that is not what is in the bill. And this House will have the common sense and the opportunity that if someone was to seek a much greater widening of it, because I, for one, do not believe that we should be looking to restrict other activities, be it in terms of wider aspects of fishing, shooting, etc. I do support the right in terms of country sports. So that is not in the bill. It is also the case, I think, that those of us who support the bill are not in some form of sentimental haze of ignorance. And I think there's a recognition, which I think is reflected within the bill, the proposed bill, that we accept that it is not a question of simply being sentimental to everything in the countryside, that there is a need for pest control, for protection of livestock, and indeed methodology which can help both in terms of biodiversity and conservation. Mention has been made, and indeed one of the contradictions of those who would oppose the bill today, it is undoubtedly the case that in terms of methodology of controlling the animal population to ensure that there is that conservation takes place. It is undoubtedly the case that hunting with dogs is one of the least efficient methods that can be. Well, you know, the evidence is that in terms of the frequency of hunts that have taken place, that quite often, indeed, it is quite often the case that a good huntsman does not catch the hare, that indeed it is the chase in and of itself, and that indeed getting a situation in which you get a large number of horses and hounds to chase one particular fox does not appear to be a particularly efficient means of doing it. Well, I'll give way briefly, yes.
The member for giving way briefly. The sedentary member seeks evidence in relation to the inefficiency of wildlife control in terms of hunting. The Westminster Government inquiry into hunting with dogs concluded that the overall contribution of traditional fox hunting within the overall total control of techniques involving dogs is almost insignificant in terms of management of the fox population as a whole. Thank the member for giving way.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, there is clear evidence within that, and I think it stands fairly much to reason that it's not a particularly efficient way of doing it. What we are left with, because we are asked at the second stage to deal with the principles of the bill, and the key principle to my mind, and again, I respectfully disagree with some others in this House, is that hunting remains a cruel pursuit, and hunting with dogs a cruel pursuit and an efficient pursuit, and one I think that as a society we have to then make a decision as to what is acceptable to our society in terms of animal welfare, in terms of animal cruelty, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And I think from a point of view of principle, in the same way as various other activities down the years were at one stage accepted in our society, they have at various stages then been banned, perhaps the most recent within this being hare coursing 11 years ago, but a range of other activities. I believe that it is not the mark of a civilised society to be embracing hunting with dogs. I believe there are better, less cruel ways of doing this. I think that biodiversity and conservation can be maintained in other and better ways. I believe that the legislation itself, if it is successful today, will undergo that level of scrutiny. And I have to say, I appreciate the point that was made earlier about the pressures that are on the committee, but there are a range of committees. There are a lot of committees that are having to deal with a large number of bills. And if that is something which is truly an important consideration, then there will be quite a number of private members' pieces of legislation which would be dropped accordingly, and indeed perhaps raised, I think, by the party opposite, a number of them emanating from that party. So there's got to be a level of consistency of approach within that. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I welcome the proposal that's brought forward today. If it is successful, I believe that it will be subject to that level of scrutiny, and that is the point that we have to do. But I think there's a key challenge in terms of what we as a society and what we as an assembly regard as being acceptable, and consequently I believe from the point of view of principle, and on a personal basis I believe from a point of principle, that hunting of this nature is something which is abhorrent to society, and consequently I support the second reading of the bill today.
I call Rachel Woods.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and unsurprisingly I rise today on behalf of the Green Party to support this bill at second stage, and I do thank the member for bringing it forward. And sadly, as we have learned, Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK without a ban on hunting with dogs, and this is long overdue that these horrific practices are outlawed. Hunting with dogs is cruel and unnecessary, and the hunted animal suffers immeasurably. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. One of the things that has struck me in this debate is this argument about minority rights, that hunting is a minority pursuit. Well, it may well be, but I'm sorry, you don't have the right to be cruel to animals.
Thank the member for his intervention, and I welcome his contribution and also welcome his party support for all minority rights issues going forward in this House. So, The Green Party Northern Ireland strongly objects to the obsolete and inhumane practice of hunting wild animals with dogs, and we have been at the forefront of this for many years. In 2010, Brian Wilson MLA submitted legislation to adopt the same prohibition on hunting foxes with horses that was introduced in England, Scotland and Wales, and it was disappointing that the bill didn't pass then. And I have to say that the Hansard's official report of that debate makes for some very interesting reading, and especially because many of the same arguments have been made again today, a decade later. These arguments are still found wanting, and they do not reflect the public opinion, and it is important that members reflect on this. Public opinion, if anything, has only increased against hunting. According to PETA, a poll carried out by Survation in 2019 found that the overwhelming majority of the public in Northern Ireland want to see hunting deer, foxes, hares and rabbits with dogs made illegal. And as Mr Blair has outlined in his own consultation, 78% of respondents had said that hunting, searching, coursing, capturing or killing of wild mammals with dogs should be banned here. And so public opinion is strong on this matter, and it has clearly strengthened in recent years. And so I just want to touch upon a few things in the bill, and I do thank the member for meeting with me prior to second stage, and also for his engagement and work with the all-party group on animal welfare too on this bill. The member will be aware of our discussions on the need for enforcement on puppy farms as well. We've discussed that on licensing and also the roles of local councils. And I raise this here for the purposes of Clause 4, which has caused some debate, as well as Clause 6. And I had previously discussed with the member if he considered licensing prescribed areas within those clauses. You know, could local councils handle this? Could they be part of that to take the pressure off the PSNI, which seems to have come up as another excuse for voting against this bill at second stage? You know, could there be appropriate monitoring of hunts when they do take place under Clause 4? But also, how do we ensure that public land use is monitored effectively and enforced? And it brings us back to who's tasked with the enforcement of this. And I know the members outlined PSNI, of course, there's role for criminal justice system. And I also look forward to as a member of the Justice Committee, making comment perhaps on this bill, as we have outlined in the amendments. And if the bill does pass second stage, I want to outline just on animal welfare officers, I would maybe encourage the committee to look at the resourcing and the number of animal welfare officers that we do have in Northern Ireland. It's a matter I know many of us have been discussing and raising, not only on constituency matters, but also in relation to puppy farming and inadequate resources that are in place. Perhaps the committee could look at this too. Not that I want to give the committee any more work to do, but should the bill pass second stage, it would be one to consider and discuss with local government and also the Justice Minister, as this will need resourced. And as many members will know, there's been a lobby against this bill, and many constituents have raised concerns about the bill's scope. But this bill, for me, is tight. It will not criminalise a situation where a dog runs after or follows a mammal or an animal when a person is engaged in another activity, such as angling. I don't see that in there at all. It is my understanding that this does not constitute an offence under the bill, but of course, should the member want to give solid clarity on that, that would be welcome for those who have raised such concerns. And again, with regard to Clause 4 on the exemptions, and I have raised this with the member in charge who gave an explanation, but this was a concern that actually there would be a loophole if it wasn't a requirement for all conditions to be met. But I have been assured that all conditions in 4 must be met. And again, perhaps this is something that the member or indeed the committee could look at to make sure that that is obvious to the reader, clearly understood in the EFM, or if he would maybe take a friendly amendment, a suggested one, for the department to produce guidance on this, as this is quite important for people when understanding the legislation. It is worth noting that the bill includes a ban on trail hunting that does not exist already in the rest of the UK, and that is because trail hunting, as we know, has been used as a cover for actual hunting in England. And it is welcome that the bill closes this loophole. Drag hunting, to answer Mr Buckley's question, is where artificial scents are laid and is permitted underneath this bill. And it is also worth mentioning in this debate, and something for consideration and future legislative change, is the possibility of a ban on hunting with snares. and animal snares are a cruel and painful practice which cause unnecessary suffering to animals. And the Welsh Government has recently announced its intention to introduce a ban, and I believe that it is time for Northern Ireland to follow suit. And I did raise this with Minister Poots last month, but I am disappointed that he has no immediate plans to reform the legislation to ban the sale, manufacture and use of restraints in Northern Ireland. And similarly, this debate is also an opportunity to raise the need to strengthen and enforce the wildlife order and also legislation on animal welfare, which is completely lacking, and to call for an end to badger baiting as well. However, I understand the need to focus in this bill, given the purposes of it and the timescale available to us in this mandate. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe that fox hunting, stag hunting and hare coursing have no place in civilised society, and we need to go further on a lot of these barbaric practices and to put a stop to them. I do not accept this bill will ruin anyone's way of life, and hypothetical arguments around pest control do not hold sway. They are simply not rooted in fact. Hunting with dogs has no place in our society, and seeing wild animals tortured and killed in such a cruel way should not be considered a sport or deemed to be entertainment. And arguments about controlling the fox population, as we have heard from Mr Lyttle, do not stand. It is not countryside management, and just because something was once an accepted thing to do does not make it legitimate today. And so therefore I am pleased to support this bill at a second stage.
I call Jim Allister.
Mr. Speaker, could I first of all apologise to Mr Blair that I wasn't in the House for his opening in this, and indeed to the House for not being present during the early parts of this debate. I had a family funeral I had to attend earlier today. In respect of this bill, I do have to say this. I think it's ill-considered. I think it's needless. And I think in some parts it is very poorly drafted. It really is a triumph of prejudice against some country pursuits. And I think, if I might say it, that it's an overreach on the sponsor's part in terms of imposing his view of the world, particularly on country communities. A good starting point in looking at any legislative proposal is to ask the question, is the current law adequate? Mr Stalford, in his last intervention, made the point, you have no right to be cruel. Indeed, that's exactly why one of the last acts of the old Parliament in Northern Ireland in 1972 was the Welfare of Animals Act, followed through with some updates in this House in 2011. And for those 50 years, it has been a criminal offence to cause unnecessary suffering to an animal in any circumstances, including in the course of hunting. And cruelty itself is defined in that legislation as unnecessary suffering. You would think, listening to some in this debate, that we're entering into the novel territory of suddenly, for the first time, embracing the concept of avoiding cruelty to animals. But this bill isn't about targeting cruelty. This bill is about targeting hunting per se. That's the target in this bill. I'll give way if I have time at the end, because time is limited. It's not that there even has to be a kill to create illegality in this bill. It's the chase that is to be criminalised by this bill. And to be done in a way which is wholly oppressive. Because what this bill creates in clause 1 is a strict liability offence, as Mr. Blair intends. That's the starting point and that's the finishing point in this bill, that you shall create a strict liability offence. Now, what is a strict liability offence? Well, it's one where you don't have to bother with showing intention. It's one to which there's no excuse. It's one to which, if it happens, no matter what the circumstances, it's an offence. Let's take some examples. Driving with no insurance is a strict liability offence. Doesn't matter that you forgot to renew your insurance. Doesn't matter that you thought you'd renewed it. Doesn't matter that you told the wife to renew it and she didn't do it. It doesn't matter anything. No excuse will broach a prosecution for no insurance, for very good reason, that it is critically of public interest importance that you do not allow any leeway for circumstances where other members of the public can be injured by your acts. Therefore, you cannot have any excuse for not having no insurance. They are few and far between in the law, offences of strict liability. Another is statutory rape. If someone has intercourse with someone under the age of 14 or under, doesn't matter what the consent was, doesn't matter what the excuse was, doesn't matter what the belief was as to age, it is statutory rape. It is a strict liability offence. And what Mr. Blair is seeking to create here is the strict liability offence that if you're out walking a dog and a dog chases a mammal, it's an offence. Now, I say that because of the marriage between Clause 1 and Clause 6.3. Because 6.3 is very clear in Section 1. That's the one that makes it the strict liability offence of participating in hunting a wild animal with a dog. In Section 1, the reference to participation in the hunting of a wild mammal with a dog includes a reference to participation in another activity, in the course of which a dog hunts a wild animal. So the other activity could be walking the dog. Many's a Sunday afternoon when I had a golden retriever. I walked by the banks of the Kellswater River. And if my dog had run off and killed a rabbit, nay, not even killed a rabbit, chased a rabbit, hunted a rabbit, under this legislation, I would be guilty of an offence. How absurd is that? And it's not just loose, careless drafting. 6.3 is there for a purpose. It's there to underscore the strict liability of Clause 1. It's there deliberately, consciously, to make it a strict liability offence if you're engaged in an activity such as walking your dog and your dog merely chases, hunts a mammal. You've committed an offence. Now, what happens to a farmer in the community who's convicted of an offence such as this, who holds a firearms certificate? The first knock he will get at the door is from the PSNI on the foot of a criminal conviction, asking him to hand over his weapon, his shotgun. All because Mr. Blair thinks it's right to create a strict liability offence out of a dog doing a natural thing of chasing a rabbit. That's why I say this is an absurd piece of legislation in its reach and in its intent. Because Mr. Blair told the Agricultural Committee he wanted to create a strict liability offence. That's what he wants this House to vote for, to create such a strict liability offence. And that is why I will not be voting for this bill. Yeah, I'll give way to Mr. Stalford.
Thank you, Mr. Allister, for giving way. You say that the bill isn't about the targeting of cruelty, it's about the targeting of hunting. But the fundamental issue at stake here is that hunting is a form of cruelty. And that's what the bill targets. And no matter the hypotheticals that are outlined about dogs chasing rabbits across fields, the fact of the matter is that what we're talking about is a practice whereby packs of dogs chase animals, and if there's a successful conclusion, the animals end up dead and ripped to pieces. That is a form of cruelty.
About much more. I could begin to understand this bill if that's what it was talking about. This bill is talking about any chase, anywhere, by any dog of any mammal. That's what this bill is talking about. Now, if the intent was what Mr. Stalford says, and what Mr. Blair might later tell us really was his intent, then why was it not drafted that way? Why was it drafted in this wholly inclusive way that it becomes a strict liability offence for a dog to chase a rabbit? Really? I'll give way to well, I'll start here and work round if I have time.
Thank you, Mr. Allister. Thank you for giving way. I just want to clarify, and maybe this is a technical point, but the interpretation of 6.1, and this is in relation to your comments of 6.3, and I appreciate the members giving examples of the hypotheticals, but would there not need to be a person and dog in pursuit for that to be met?
If the bill stopped at 6.1, yes, but 6.1 is then superseded by 6.3. And 6.3 is the point that takes you to the position where man walking dog, dog's off the lead, dog runs away, chases. That's all it takes. Hunts a rabbit. Offence complete. Because the man has been taking part in the activity, and then it says in 6.3, in the course of which a dog hunts. Not in the course of which a man and dog hunts, in the course of which a dog hunts. So the actus reus of the offence is the dog hunting the rabbit. And you don't need any mens rea, you don't need any intent. That's it. End of. Mr. Stalford made a point about the cruelty. Yes. What I don't hear talk about is take some of our diminishing species. Take the curlew, which foxes present a real threat to. I'm sure when the fox catches the curlew and pulls it to bits, it's pretty cruel. But in this situation, the only interest is someone catches the fox. How can that be right? Yes?
The difference is that we're human beings endowed with conscience, whereas a fox killing a bird is going about what obviously is natural to it. We can exercise our conscience not to be cruel.
The dog that chases the rabbit isn't doing it out of a call of conscience, he's doing it out of natural instinct. And yet we want to make natural instinct a criminal offence. Criminal offence. Give way.
Very much, the member for giving way. I too have reservations about hunting foxes with a pack of dogs. However, like the member opposite, I've had dogs all my life, mostly golden retrievers. And as a member himself would know, you can't keep them out of water and you can't keep them from chasing wild animals. It's their natural instinct. My last dog was a Newfoundland, which is a heck of a bit bigger, but a dog more in love with the water. I have reservations about this bill. I cannot support this bill in its current form. Yes, while I would agree that it's cruel to chase an animal to exhaustion and rip it apart if you catch it, that is cruel. But what about the fox? The damage the fox does. You mentioned curlew, but there's also lapwing, grouse, corncrake and plovers.
all ground nesting birds taken by foxes. To ask anybody in here from a country background like me what a fox can do if it gets into a hen house, it doesn't kill for food. It kills every hen, every one in the hen house. It'll kill it. That's cruel. But it's the fox's instinct. And we're making legislation here to curb animal instincts, but not the fox. The fox has no natural enemies that I'm aware of. It has to be culled. It's a pest. The grey squirrel is a pest. Rats, pest. Mice, pest. So I cannot understand the legislation that's trying to protect a fox. Yes, I have reservations about the dogs, as everybody has of a right mind, but it's the damage they do to the countryside. Mr. Allister and I had walked our dogs across the countryside and they took off because they weren't on the lead. We're country people.
Order, order. Can I remind members that interventions should be brief? And
thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I shall be brief. Neither he or I would be here today because we'd be in jail. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Well, I can only respond that the member is correct. This, to put it very shortly, is pro-pest legislation. Pro-pest legislation. Save the pest, criminalise the dog walker. Yes?
Thank the member for giving way. So the member support the principles of the bill. Will the member be bringing forward amendments at committee stage? And does he acknowledge that there are other methods of control, such as fencing, non-lethal traps, removal and noise and scent repellents? There are ways to control wildlife other than that which is being put forward today.
Sorry, the member
order, member. Can I ask the member to bring his remarks to a close?
Yes.
15 minutes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Lyttle wasn't listening to me because I made it very plain. I am not supporting the principle of this bill because the principle of this bill is to make it to criminalise walking my dog. I cannot accept that.
I call Claire Sugden.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to support the second stage of Mr Blair's private member's bill and to concur with Mr Stalford and other members earlier in this debate. Generally, and on the point of principle, I fully support what Mr Blair is trying to do in this bill because this type of sport is barbaric. And I think at this point, listening to the contributions that we've heard just previous, I think it's a differential in defining what we mean by sport and what we mean by instinct. You know, it's almost the difference between prevention versus encouragement. And this bill is trying to stop encouraging humans to encourage their animals to this type of animal abuse. Indeed, listening to other members who do raise interesting points in conflict with this proposed legislation do so on the basis of detail rather than principle. And I'm not sure at this point if it is actually necessary to amend Mr Blair's bill to address these points, whilst given effect to stop this form of animal cruelty. But I do think it is something we should look at if these are genuine reasons as to why people are uncomfortable with this bill. I appreciate Mr McGlone's contribution in this area. So for about 5 minutes, a number of years ago, I was the Minister of Justice, and I met with Mr McGlone and a delegation of those involved with country sports. It's not a support that I have ever been interested in or I am particularly familiar with, so I do actually reflect their experience and their expertise in this area. So when Mr McGlone, in all fairness, is raising concerns, I do think we have to be cognizant to some of those. And I won't be disingenuous because I am supporting this bill because this abuse does need to stop. However, if we can reassure or satisfy, even in the next stages, those who raise valid concerns on the unintended consequences, then I, as others have indicated as well, would be happy to look at those. Specifically, Mr McGlone raised issues in relation to firearms certificates. So again, in my previous role, I had experience of this. Mr McGlone is right that it is the firearms branch in the PSNI who are responsible for granting and revoking licences. And in cases of appeal, the process sometimes ends with the Minister of Justice. So I have read my fair share of firearms appeals. And Mr McGlone again is correct that a criminal offence is not necessarily required to remove a firearms licence. Other reasons can remove it too. And I do think that's fine if these reasons are informed, unbiased, proportionate and thoughtful of risk. But human nature is such that error and bias are inevitable in some cases, and perspective also has an... Yeah, sure.
Appreciate the member giving way. Reference to be made obviously to clause 6, and Mr Blair will be able to address this. I suspect the reason why that clause is included, or particularly the one that Mr Allister referred to, I suspect the reason why that is included is because of the deceitfulness that we have seen from hunts in England and Wales, whereby trail hunting and drag hunting has been used as an opportunity to try and get round the law that exists there.
I thank Mr Stalford for his intervention. I suppose to try and draw it back to the point that I was making. Yes, I think it is such that human nature is that people will do those things, but that at the same time doesn't mean that we shouldn't write good law in this respect. And certainly, again, I fully support this bill. But if we can make it better, does that not get to where we all want to be in terms of those things? So I suppose that, and the point that I was trying to make was actually something in response to what Mr Stalford had said earlier in terms of intent, in that is it enough to assume intent given that all the potential variables that do alter perception, or do we need to strengthen this law so that the unintended consequences, again, that Mr McGlone and others speak of are not reached? So again, clarification, I do support this bill, but if we need to strengthen it, then that's something that we need to do. Let's take it to the next stage. Let's get it to a point where we need to and stop the abuse and address those concerns that members have. Excuse me, like all members, I too have received a lot of correspondence from constituents on both sides of this debate, to the end that John has his own folder in my email inbox. Anecdotally, I would say that I probably have received more from those who support the bill, but there are many reasons which this could be the case, so I don't intend to focus on the numbers, but rather the reasons outlined. And overwhelmingly, people do see this as cruel, unnecessary, outdated, barbaric, and I do agree. And the counter-arguments in this vein do nothing to persuade me otherwise. I received correspondence, as I'm sure others have, describing this activity as traditional, social, harmless. My goodness, it is not harmless, and it can only be described as harmless in a world where animal welfare is disregarded. And it's not the world we live in. I'm sure in some areas it is. It's not where we need to be in 2021, and it is interesting to hear contributions from others where this debate happened over 10 years ago, and some of the same arguments were being put across. But Northern Ireland, it can exist in its own bubble, but this one really does need burst. Because abuse, sadly, can be social. It is most definitely traditional, but that does not make it right, or indeed a behaviour that we should continue to accept because that's what we always have done, or crudely because it's someone's hobby. And similar to the points raised by Mr McGlone and others, there is the concern, and just recently we've heard that from Mr Allister and others, and I'll quote it, that a person participating in any activity where they have a dog and that dog pursues, chases or follows a wild animal, then that person engaging in that or other activity is participating in hunting for the purposes of the bill and therefore could make them a criminal. Now, I did not interpret that from the draft legislation, but I'm not legally trained. Mr Allister is, so maybe he raises a valid point. So I suppose what I'm asking Mr Blair, and even just in terms of the point Mr Allister made about a strict liability offence, that's the offence that's currently is drafted. Can we mitigate that in some way so that it doesn't put that strict liability offence onto those people, so that it isn't a case that if you're walking your dog that you will potentially be committing an offence? Let's not make this an excuse to do something which is right. Another compelling argument for me, usually in these types of debate, is that we are the only region of the UK not to have this law. Now, we don't always have to fall in line with other regions of the UK or indeed Ireland, but certainly other areas of the UK and Ireland who broadly are like-minded with us and have similar set of circumstances and environment have now set a standard against animal cruelty. So why then do some in this House want to be at odds to that? Why are they opposed to positive legislation and our policy which wants to remove a form of animal cruelty? That's a really odd key message. And I appreciate if it is in the detail, let's work on that, rather than throwing out something positive for Northern Ireland that quite a lot of people, probably the majority of people, want to see ended. And again, I will reference Mr Stalford. This is second stage. Surely the principle is to stop this type of animal cruelty, and I really don't understand how anyone would be opposed to that. Turning to a notable justification, perhaps made by other members, saying there is not enough time in this mandate to get it through is a really poor argument not to support this piece of legislation. And it will be really interesting to see if that same rationale is applied by those members to other bills in this mandate, particularly from their own party. Let the process fail this bill. Let 3 years of no government fail this bill. But don't fail this bill or through mealy-mouthed tactic to ride both sides of this argument because you're worried about an election next year. If the practical concerns really are your driver, that at least send a message, a key message, that this form of animal cruelty is wrong by supporting this stage of the bill. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I now call John Blair, and you have up to 15 minutes to conclude and wind up the debate.
Deputy Speaker, can I thank you and thank all members for their participation and contribution to the debate. It's been a respectful debate, even in its more lively moments. Deputy Speaker, as I outlined at the start, and I want to repeat, it's been said by others, but we need to re-emphasise this. Northern Ireland is the only part of the United Kingdom without a ban on hunting with dogs. In fact, the legislation in other jurisdictions has been in place for 2 decades or so. There's a chance here, now, to do better. I will, before I conclude on our opportunities to do better, take a few moments to reflect on the comments of members. I'll apologise in advance if I don't get through them all due to time constraints. The debate began with the Chair of the IRA Committee, Declan McAleer, talking to about evidence given to that committee and the further committee consideration on matters around impact in rural areas and the committee's process to scrutinise the proposed bill. He then separately informed us that he would not be, as a Sinn Féin member, supporting that further scrutiny and would be, with his colleagues, voting against the bill today. And I'm going to make more comments on that later, separate to my reference to the IRA Committee. William Irwin, who's also a member of the IRA Committee, felt like a meeting of the IRA Committee for the first 5 or 6 speakers here today, perhaps not unusually. William Irwin talked about the dog walkers. This will be a recurring theme through this, and I hope I can give some reassurance. But on this one, I'll concentrate on some other issues. And he made reference to existing legislation in badger baiting. And there lies a comparison. There is existing legislation on badger baiting. Whether or not they are a nocturnal animal, there is still a scent. I'll repeat what I said earlier. I know of no circumstance where a dog walker has been criminalised because their dog has followed the scent of a badger. I'll return later to further examination and conversations with the people and further scrutiny. I will give way.
Viability in respect to badger baiting?
It's a fair point. I didn't say it was there, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I said there was legislation existing. Mr. Irwin also alleged, and I'm seeking to give an assurance here, this is not a criticism, there was a misrepresentation of the rural community. I hope he's not here at the moment, but I think that he would take my assurance that none of that is intended. I represent a rural constituency, as he does, and that is not at all the intent of the bill. In fact, the intent of the bill is fairly clearly defined and in a relatively limited number of sections. Patsy McGlone spoke as a DAERA Committee member and SDLP member, also spoke of his own commitment to animal welfare and also spoke of his interest in country sports. Patsy made specific reference to his concern around groups of people hunting, and the Section 6 discussion started probably properly when Patsy spoke. And I want to give him an assurance at this point that I'm happy to have further conversations. And I'll relate later that commitment to further conversations to any allegation that I'm involved in any kind of doublespeak, because I'm willing to talk to people and have further discussions and participate in committee scrutiny. Rosemary Barton spoke as a DAERA Committee member and as a member of the Ulster Unionist Party, committed to accepting and supporting that the bill could move forward to stage 2, and I want to put on record that I am very grateful for that. But Rosemary also referred to the fact that she would like to see further clarification. We met before today's session. We will have opportunities as DAERA Committee colleagues to discuss there, and I will give a commitment here to discuss separately also with Rosemary or colleagues if required. Following that, Harvey spoke of the process that the bill would take and further committee scrutiny, but unfortunately then clarified that he would not be supporting the continuation of the bill to that stage. Christopher Stalford followed that, speaking in support of the bill, made clear he wasn't always of that view, but gave some specific examples of what had contributed to his change of mind on this issue. My own colleague Chris Lyttle followed that, spoke in support, and I'm grateful. Chris also referenced the League Against Cruel Sports, a particular official of that organisation called Janice Watt, and I want to also put on record my appreciation to Janice for her work done on this issue, but also on a whole raft of animal welfare issues and the work she does in the interests of animals. Jonathan Buckley spoke commented that he was a member of the APG in country sports. I think the conclusion is that he's of a different mind of me on most of this legislation. He referenced that there might be an attempt to impose moral judgment on minorities. Rachel Wood subsequently stole a line I might have used on that. But that's a position I'm well familiar with. It is not my intention. I think Jonathan Buckley did acknowledge once or twice that he didn't think I had any hidden agenda in relation to this bill, that I'd been fairly upfront and straightforward with my intention. But I can assure him the intent of the bill is there. It's about the hunting of wild mammals with dogs, where dogs are used for the kill. There's no intention to go wider in terms of any other aspect of country life or country sport. I'm happy to repeat that, and if I have to continue to repeat that, it doesn't cause me any problem at all. Dolores Kelly spoke of existing party policy from an SDLP point of view, and also referenced that we might be living in hopefully a kinder post-COVID era if we're looking at these issues and how we should deal with these issues legislatively. Peter Weir, also speaking in support, spoke of differences across communities and the fact that it can't categorise people in this regard, and there are differences in rural community, difference of opinion, and also in political parties and lots of other categories of people that he referenced. He spoke too of need for further examination of Section 6. I, in an exchange with Mr Weir during his speech, gave a commitment to at least have discussions around the inclusion of the word willing in terms of participation or organisation of a hunt, if that clarified matters. That is not a commitment to change. That is a discussion which, given the numbers in this House, will depend on the willingness of others. Rachel Woods followed that by speaking in support. Spoke of some concerns around Clause 4 and matters of enforcement, which she and I have discussed separately, as she referenced. I can repeat here that I've already undertaken work quite separate to this bill about how the role of council animal welfare officers interfaces with the PSNI welfare and wildlife section, for example, and also the DAERA business area of animal welfare based in Ballykelly. So I'm trying to get more clarification about how all those groups of people interface, how they react, how they provide service across our areas, including our council areas, and how, if we can, make that better. So if Rachel Woods is committing to take some of these matters forward to the Justice Committee, and I welcome that, I should probably clarify that some of the work that I've undertaken may well end up at the DAERA committee also. Finally, Claire Sugden spoke in support of the bill, referenced some of the complications faced during her previous time as Justice Minister, and referenced the need also to have further conversations. I haven't left Mr Allister out. I'll come to him in a moment. I am happy, Deputy Speaker, to give Claire Sugden the assurance that those conversations will take place, I've said, before committee or with parties or with individuals, more than. And I hope I can give Mr Allister the assurance, and he spoke before her, that there is no double speak or double standard in my position, or hoping to do that, or pledging to do that. I cannot be sure of Mr Allister's capacity for compromise and flexibility, but I can assure him of my willingness to seek to do that if it achieves the overall aim, or a portion of the aim, or most of the aim, which is in the interest of animal welfare in this regard. Yes, absolutely.
The member indicates that he would anticipate putting the word willing before participate in a hunt. Could I suggest to him that that solves nothing? Because in 6.3, the participation is not in the hunt. The participation is in the activity from which the dog then hunts. So mere willing participation does nothing to diminish the problem. The problem that the member has with this is that deliberately he sought to make it a strict liability offence. And unless he relinquishes that, then he is not going to make amends on this. And if he is relinquishing that, then the proper thing to do, since that is the cornerstone of the bill, is to withdraw the bill and come back with one that doesn't have that cornerstone.
Yes, of course.
That what has characterised this debate throughout much of this debate has been an obsessive focus on technical issues, and that's part of our job, of course, but at its core, those who are pursuing that route simply want hunting to continue, and it can't.
Deputy Speaker, I'll respond to both interventions and thank the members both for them. Look, I am, of course, prepared to listen to the points put forward by Mr Allister also, but Mr Stalford made a very valid point. Ultimately, there is a clear difference between those who support the continued practice of hunting with dogs, where dogs are used for the kill, and those who don't. And I'm sure members have guessed I am one of those who don't. Yes, of course, briefly.
I thank the member for giving way, and I appreciate the positive sense in which he has engaged with us in this debate today. On the particular clause 2 in trail hunting, and I know the member will know and he can clarify because he's the bill sponsor, that this bill seeks to make illegal trail hunting but not drag hunting. That's my understanding. So the member could perhaps define to the House what those 2 points are, because there's some in the House that didn't know that whenever they spoke earlier. But on that point, how would the police therefore differentiate in the two? Have you given any thought to that?
Well, there would be evidence, Deputy Speaker, because there are differences in the scent used between the various types of hunts, drag hunting, clean boot hunting and trail hunting. But I'll go back to a point made earlier. Trail hunting was created to overcome the ban on hunting wild mammals with dogs in other jurisdictions, and we have seen, as demonstrated in recent legal actions that, and outcomes in the court in Westminster, that it was clearly exploited to overcome illegal hunting, and a loophole had been created. So there are differences there. All are practiced. The clean boot hunting and drag hunting are not included because they have been proven to be less lethal, much fewer reports, much less coverage of any incidents, and therein I draw the distinction. Deputy Speaker, some members following the or during their contributions may have gone off the scent a bit. I've waited all day to say that. It feels like all day, raising concern that the dog walkers from returning and that could be criminalised if the bill was passed. That is not the intent. I did refer to this earlier, but given the nature of the issue, I think it warrants a few additional comments. The issues around badgers and existing legislation I have covered. Interpretation of the bill and further conversations I have also covered. But I am keen to look again at that, engage with members, and for party members and independent members who want to make clear, I reached out to all parties before today. I'll do the same after today, and I'm happy to be approached at any point. Deputy Speaker, more than anything, I want to reassure members that I am happy for this issue and other issues to be given further scrutiny at committee, and there may well be additional issues brought forward following today's debate. And I'll be of any assistance I can in relation to members' concern. I also want to repeat my commitment that the bill currently is as intended. I've heard the thin edge of the wedge conversations and points raised previously. I think they were done with no ill intent, but I want to make it clear that I do not wish to add to this bill in relation to any other form of country sport. So with that in mind, and the chance for change in the interest of animal welfare and to address public concern, I appeal to members to support the bill at this stage and to allow that further scrutiny, including the discussion of concerns raised by members. Though finally, and in particular, I appeal on the floor of this House to Sinn Fein to make good on their party commitment made by their party president, Mary Lou MacDonald, in February 2020, when she told animal welfare charities in Ireland that at the next opportunity to vote for a ban on fox hunting, they would do it if they could. That opportunity is here. This is the time, and the limited time of this mandate, to seize the opportunity and not to seek reasons for equivocation. In addition to that, I'll give way very briefly on that point.
Thank the member for giving way. Is the member suggesting that maybe not only are Sinn Féin not opposed to hunting with hounds, but neither are they averse to running with hares?
I'm not going to seek, Deputy Speaker, to be any more mischievous than I already have been. But in addition to the point and the intervention made by the member, I would like the members referred to consider an additional factor. If this bill succeeds at this time, it is easier to pick up on this bill in the new mandate referred to earlier by Mr McAleer. If the bill fails at this stage, it is more difficult to pick up in the new mandate. I would ask them and all members to consider that with voting and find the support for the bill that I saw earlier. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Members, the question is that the second stage of the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. Clear the lobbies. The question will be put again in 3 minutes. I would remind you that we should continue to uphold social distancing and that members who have proxy voting arrangements in place should not come into the chamber. Order, members. The following tellers have been appointed. Tellers for the ayes, Chris Lyttle and Paula Bradshaw. Tellers for the noes, Cathal Boylan and Harvey. Before the Assembly decide, I want to remind you that as per Standing Order 112, the Assembly currently has proxy voting arrangements in place. Members who have authorised another member to vote on their behalf are not entitled to vote in person and should not enter the lobbies. I remind all members of the requirement for social distancing while the division takes place. I ask that you ensure that you retain at least a 2-metre gap between yourself and other people while moving around in the chamber or the rotunda, and especially in the lobbies. Please be patient at all times, observe the signage and follow the instructions of the lobby clerks. Clear the lobbies. The Assembly will divide. Ayes to my right, noes to my left. Clerk, please read the result.
83 members voted, 38 members voted aye, 45 members voted no. The motion is negatived.
The motion is negatived. The motion is negatived. Unfasten the doors. The second stage of the Hunting of Wild Mammals Bill is not agreed. The bill falls. Turn now to item 7 on the order paper, the adjournment. The question is that the Assembly do now adjourn. The Assembly is adjourned.